Let's look now at 4 parables about wealth from Luke to gain some additional insights. These parables are the parable of the rich fool, the parable of the dishonest manager, the rich man and Lazarus, and the parable of the pounds. These parables are all found in what is known as Luke's travel narrative. Luke's travel narrative begins in 951 and goes to 1948. This is a collection of material that is largely unique to Luke's gospel. It is called the travel narrative because in 951 Luke states, "When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem." This marks an obvious transition in the narrative, but interestingly, Jesus takes almost forever to get there. Jesus had been in Galilee, and then he immediately entered a Samaritan village. This would be the most direct route to Jerusalem, since Jerusalem is south of Galilee, and Samaria is south of Galilee and north of Jerusalem. This would not be the normal path a Jew would take, however, since most Jews would skirt around to the east to avoid Samaria. But you're reading along, and before you know it, Jesus is back in Galilee again. What is fascinating about Luke's narrative is that the reader is constantly being reminded about Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. We see this reminder in 13:32 through 33, 17:11, 18:31, and 19:28. Whole books have been written on Luke's travel narrative, and I won't go into all the possibilities here. Biblical scholars agree that Luke's placement of these references is significant, and various theories have been proposed as to why Luke does this. But a growing consensus seems to be that Luke wants the reader to see Jesus as a prophetic figure, a new Moses. The repeated journey references would evoke the image of a new Exodus. In any case, these 4 parables are located within Luke's travel narrative. We will look at them individually. The rich fool. The first parable is this parable of the rich fool, found in Luke 12:13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought for himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger barns, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I will say to myself, soul, you have ample goods, laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." There are several things to notice about this parable. The parable is told in direct response to a fight over inheritance. Someone in the crowd says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Jesus initially responds that he is not a judge or an arbiter, and then states to the crowd, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. That is the theme that leads into the parable. On the surface, many of us, especially those of us in Western North America of North American perspective, would look at this man and say he was a smart financial planner. He has an IRA, he has a 401k, and he's prepared. He took some of his excess and set it aside. But a couple of things must be noted here. The initial statement was that life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. The man who asked the question had lost his father, and the dispute over the inheritance was getting in the way of his relationship with his brother. Wealth should not come before family, and death of a parent should cause grief and reflection rather than an immediate, how do I get my share of the inheritance? The point of the parable is located at the end of the parable. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. There are 2 points here. Those who store up treasures for themselves, and those who are not rich toward God. So store up treasures for themselves, not rich toward God. Let's look at the second point, and then come back to the first. This man was not rich toward God. There is no reference in this story about any generosity on this man's part. He doesn't share any of his great harvest. By this man, we're talking now about the man who built the barns. He doesn't share any of his great harvest, but keeps the entire harvest for himself. No offerings to the temple. No helping those who are less well off. He is not rich toward God. Now let's look at the first part. Those who store up treasures for themselves. It is important to understand the difference between hoarding and productive capital. We will explain this more fully in another lecture, but we need to touch on it right now. What do we mean by hoarding, and what do we mean by productive capital? Hoarding is simply gathering more resources than you need for immediate use. Those goods, however, don't really accomplish anything. A storehouse full of grain is simply a storehouse full of grain. It doesn't create any more grain, at least in the ancient world. In fact, it's likely that much of that grain would be destroyed by mice and mildew. This is not treasure where moth and rust will not corrupt. It eventually would probably rot. In a modern capitalistic society, we understand that certain things can be used to generate wealth. If I have a pantry full of food, it can be used to feed my family for a few days, or maybe even a few weeks. On the other hand, if I have an entire store full of food, I can use that food to generate wealth. Assuming that the food is not perishable, I can borrow against it, I can leverage, I can use that to do all kinds of things. A better example would be something other than food. Let's look at a truck, for example. If I own a truck that I use to drive around in, it's simply a vehicle that I have for transportation. If I have a truck that I use to deliver things, thereby creating income for me, it's considered a capital good. Thus, today in America, we distinguish between consumer goods and capital goods. Consumer goods are consumed. They are used up. Capital goods are goods which are used to create wealth. Why this little mini lecture on capital? It's easy for a modern reader to look at this parable and think that having a retirement account is somehow unbiblical. A direct analogy cannot be made, however, because a retirement account is not simply hoarding. It is productive capital because a retirement account is actually working to generate additional income. So it would be a mistake to make a direct analogy here from this story and make direct application to a person in a modern economy. The point of the parable, however, is that the man is not rich toward God. So whether we have a storehouse full of grain or not, we must be rich toward God.